Louise, the philanthropic sector is really, really complex. And so I thought I'd just ask you how to understand, I guess, navigating options to pursue. Resources available can be tricky for absolutely anyone, especially if you're a small to medium organisation and you're time poor and you're resource poor and you're a bit stretched. So could you speak briefly about the types of philanthropic support available, including PAFS and PuAFS? And which are the most appropriate for small to medium organisations and practitioners to consider, and what bearing DGR status has for fund seekers? Do you think that that's a real incentive for people to come on board and back a small to medium?
Well, I think just on the DGR thing, I think it is important, but I think, Creative Partnerships Australia has, the Australian Cultural Fund. When we were running Arts Support Australia, we'd mentor a lot of artists and a lot of small to medium companies. They're just not ready to get the DGR themselves, and most funders are happy to use that auspicing vehicle. Now, there are a few exceptions to the rule, and they tend to be, PAFS, and particularly the bigger PAFS. I've known some PAFS who are prepared to do sneaky things and use it anyway, but that's up to the individual PAF. But I mean, private ancillary funds, PAFs, it sounds a bit like a tampon. I really hate that acronym. But I'm not. Too many organisations are too fixated about private ancillary funds as a source of funding. You're lucky you've got one here now who's a tremendous supporter and funder in the arts. There's not many that are. There's about 1,600 of them today. I don't know, the figure sort of varies depending on who you speak to, but most PAFs don't have a website, right? Now, the only way you're really going to... Well, how I developed my network with PAFs is I used to trawl over donor lists, so in the non-profit sector, also in the arts, and gradually over time, I'd get to know them. But, of course, when I was running Art Support, I'm not a funder. I mean, I'm not a fundee. I'm not actually seeking the funding. Public ancillary funds, there's a smaller number of those. They tend to have a smaller entry point, and they do actually raise money from the public. So it's not just typically a wealthy family that would set up their own family foundation. With PuAFS, they're often raising money from other sources. A lot of times they're more public, so you can find out more about them. But the real key is private donors, is individuals. I mean, my husband and I, we have lots of friends who could have private ancillary funds, but they've elected not to set them up. They're happy doing what they're doing. They don't want the admin burden. I think you can't... you can't neglect the individual donor. And as I said, the individual donor can start with a very, very small engagement and small donation, and then it's up to the individual arts organisation to build that over time. And I think that probably the best story is Kenneth Reid. He is a very, very prominent donor with the Australian Ballet. And many years ago, he responded to a direct mail appeal with them. I think he gave them $500. And they had a volunteer there. This is back before they had a lot of staff at the ballet. And they looked him up and saw that he was donating $500 to a few other arts organisations. And they rang him up. And they said, rather than just sending him the stock standard thank you letter for the direct appeal, rang him up and said, would you like to come into the ballet, have a sandwich? So they met the artistic director, very important, not just the fundraiser or the CEO, because that's his most important person. Had a coffee, got to know each other, loved the fact that they'd brought him in. He knew he was being wooed. 3 months later, they invited him in again, had another conversation, got to know him better. Then they thought they were ready to ask for the major gift, and they were going to ask him for 30 grand for something because they got a few clues in that second meeting. Got him in again, another 3 months later, and they were ready to do the pitch. And obviously with a major gift, you've got to ask for a specific sum of money for whatever it's going to be. And before they could even say anything, the guy said, I just think what you guys doing is terrific. I want to gift you $1 million. Now, the reality is that is
$500 to $1 million.
Extraordinary,
Are you kidding?
But
That's
the
amazing.
moral in the story is, now that's unusual because normally you've got to ask for a major gift, right, and be quite specific. But what the lesson in that story is that any one of those other 3 or 4 arts organisations could have ended up with $1 million that he'd given $500 to in the annual appeal. No one else bothered to actually build the relationship with him. And there the ballet had it. And I don't know how many millions he's donated today.
He's a bit of an iceberg donor, isn't he, really?
Yeah, but not every arts organisation's got Kenneth Watkins, heading up their fundraising.
I will just add very quickly, I know you're conscious of time, but the JB Weir is released a report just last week called the Support Report, and it actually provides the data around who's giving what to what sectors, so between PAFS, high net worths, charitable trusts, corporates, age groups, demographics, and I was just reading it on the train on the way over, and it contains some really interesting figures, particularly around the fact that it's the PAFS, there's always an individual, especially behind the smaller PAFs, so I kind of put them together with the high net worths in some ways. They are the ones that are giving the most to the arts and culture sector. So they should, while they're difficult to find, definitely be on your radar. And Louise gave some suggestions of how you can seek to find the non-public listed PAFs. But maybe someone can circulate a link to the
absolutely.
attendees afterwards. But it's an incredibly valuable read and contains some very, very useful statistical information.